Build creative confidence. Beat the inspiration addiction. Join the Writer's Gym. I am so happy to be able to bring this interview to you because I think there is nothing more important to a developing writer and human than having an understanding of the courage that we all need to find to discover and create who we are. Roz Kaveney is a poet, critic and novelist resident in London. Her novel Tiny Pieces of Skull won the Lambda, the Lemmys, as we now call it, in 2016. Her recent publications include the novel Revelations and a poetic memoir, The Great Good Time. In 2018, she published original versions of the complete poems of the Roman poet Catullus with Sad Press. When I talk to Roz, the examples that she's had to live through to become are probably a lot more extreme than the ones I've had to live through. But I feel an enormous gratitude to her as an example, because when I see her dealing with transphobia on Twitter, or when I read her incredible poetry, novels, thoughtful reviews, non-fiction, there is a dignity, there is a grace, there is eloquence under pressure. And I'm really, really happy to be able to bring this conversation to you. We talked about the Open University biog, which by the time anyone hears me say this in the future, they'll have already heard me say that version of it. But there are a couple of things that I found so helpful in the biography that you have on the Glamorous Rags website. And I know that this is from a few years ago now, but you said, I have a long and complicated personal history, which I'm in the process of turning into a memoir. Crucial facts are that I was reared a Catholic but got over it, was born male but got over it, stopped sleeping with boys about the time I stopped being one, and am much happier than I was when I was younger. And as somebody with entirely different examples of what finding who I was has meant to me, I just found that a really wonderful encapsulation of what is a huge struggle and takes a very long time, but fundamentally it's getting away from who one is told one is.
Yeah. I mean, I wasted my 20s trying not to be who I was. And that's one of the reasons why I didn't get on with writing. It took me a decade of my 30s of just being a critic before I started doing my own stuff.
Which is something else I do identify with a huge amount. And I don't know if this was similar at all for you, but it took me a while to stop myself from putting energy into being cross with the 20-something-year-old who hadn't worked out it was about doing your own thing. But I guess it was the problems were more active for you. I mean, I was in a more fortunate position in that a lot of me getting in my own way was self-inflicted.
But self-inflicted is a fairly good description, because basically I knew who I was when I was 21, and I got talked out of being that. And it's partly because I started various careers and screwed them all up, or had them screwed up for me. I mean, I got a job in television when my PhD graduation burned, and that got messed up by the 3-day week. But in fact, it was formative, because I learned confidence in my critical voice, which is what I've basically been done the rest of my life as my paid work, because I'm a publisher's reader.
And just jumping around a little bit, because we will absolutely talk about the criticism and non-fiction, but also about the poetry and the fiction. Something I personally took from Tiny Pieces of Skull, which I adore, is the way that the dialogue is so very much the engine for the plot, and you're doing what now, and even more so then, was a very important showing, not telling, that the examples of what the characters are talking to each other about, and what the sort of the bitchy power struggles, but also the way everything is so loaded, the way being who you are is dangerous.
Well, Tiny Pieces of Skull went through one draft that was almost all dialogue. And I then did a second draft where I put people in rooms and put clothes on them. And that was the draft that went round publishers and nearly got published and didn't. And then the final published version is a revision 20 odd years later. but I didn't revise the dialogue very much, except for the bit that wasn't in the original draft that's complete fiction, which is all the Mr. Carpet stuff.
Do you want to say a bit about that just for anyone who's not
I will.
read it yet?
Basically, in the original draft, Annabelle just goes to Chicago. The practical problem I realized on looking back at it after 28 years was that because it actually combines two trips to Chicago, one in 1978 and one in 1980, because in real life, I came home shortly after being raped. And it was only 18 months later that the real life equivalent of Natasha got in touch and said they were terribly sorry about everything that had happened and would I come back if they paid my fare.
And just for a quick recap, in case people haven't read it, which I hope they do because it's just utterly unique and so important. Natasha is the friend who, when we first meet Annabelle, the central character, they're having a conversation across the cafe table, essentially about what's wrong with Annabelle and how she's failing to be the woman she's supposed to be in terms of her weight, her eyebrows, her personality. And Natasha is the queen bee, as we'd often say now. I think is that fair?
Yeah, but absolutely fair. I was talking to her yesterday, and she was acknowledging that.
So you sounds like you found a way through what you needed to find a way through if you're still talking, or is it just that wonderful thing of be friends with everybody but just don't trust them up to a certain point?
Oh, exactly. I mean, we are who we are.
We are who we are.
But anyway, the point was, in the interim, I'd completed social transition. I'd also had my boobs done. And I decided that it made more sense if Annabelle, as opposed to me, had had her boobs done before she goes to the States in the first place. So I concocted this entirely imaginary episode in which Natasha is doing some slightly dodgy import jobs for a guy. And he engineers it so that Annabelle gets a chance to have her boobs done by a plastic surgeon who he's doing business with for free. And none of that ever actually happened. It's complete fabrication. But on the other hand, it reads quite well. But yes, the dialogue and the difficult bit about adding this completely new episode that was total fiction, unlike a lot of the rest of the book, is that I had to make sure the dialogue worked. But I have known people a bit like Mr. Carpet, these not exactly criminal, but weird wide boys. And I got the voice. And that's the thing. It's all a matter of getting the voice right.
And the community voice as well is something that strikes me, that the way that everyone relates to each other and sort of the level of danger that the clients pose, that the police pose.
Well, it was also that I wrote the book in 1988 about stuff that had happened in 1978 and 1980. And the thing was, by 1988, I was aware that some of the people I had known in Chicago were dead because of the epidemic. And so it was very much a matter of trying to honestly capture the voice of people I was memorializing. So I made damn sure to get it feeling right.
And I think from the point of view of members of the Writers' Gym, one of the things that I talk about a lot when people get confused by what show don't tell really means is it's, to use a truly horrible metaphor, but the closest I can get, giving a character enough rope to hang themselves, giving them the ability to show what their behaviour is. And I think just what I find, this is one of my favourite examples to talk about for this, is the way that when we meet Annabelle Jones, there's a line near the beginning that is happening just in her head. Most of what we learn about her and everyone around her is dialogue. But one of the things that really stuck with me is her relationship with the mirror, that sometimes the mirror is that true friend who says what needs to be said, but other times it's somebody just being bitchy and saying, look, you can see all of the things that are wrong with you as a person. And then as her life grows and as the proof she gives herself of what she's capable of, not just surviving, but being active in her life, the different lines about the mirror and the way the mirror is looking back at her throughout the book, I find that talking as we have about what our 20s were like and not having accepted or given ourselves the time and space to be writers, or the writers we really were. And then stepping into that, I found something very helpful in that she was building her identity and her right to her identity.
Absolutely. I mean, again, that's something that I tightened up in the final draft. It was always there, but it's something that I realised was one of the strengths of the book when I came to rewrite it. So yes, but it's also a piece of wisdom I'd acquired in middle age, looking back at my younger self. Because that's the amazing thing, chance I got with Tiny Pieces of Skull is that it was my first novel by many years, and by the time I came to revise it, I'd written a number of novellas and short stories. I'd had an abortive novel die on me, and I'd written the first 2 volumes of the gigantic fantasy novel. So I came back to it with a lot more insight than I'd had when I wrote it about the writer I wanted to be. I'd also started writing poetry again a few years, because I revised it in 2014, 2015, and I'd written a vast amount in the interim. And getting a chance to go back to early work and tinker with it is great. Never be afraid of your younger self. But in fact, a lot of what works in it was always there. I mean, the dialogue, I'd hardly changed the dialogue down the years. I had got better at dialogue generally, but that dialogue was part of how I realised that one of my strengths is dialogue, because it's the dialogue as much as anything else that makes my other novel work, because it makes the impossible plausible. And
what would be the impossible?
With that, well, I'm talking about the Rhapsody of Blood book.
Okay, so we are talking world rules.
Yeah, I mean,
we're in a different world, fantasy, or
I mean, but the other point about Tiny Pieces of Skull was that when I wrote it in 1988, much more even than people would now, it was a matter of explaining that being trans isn't just a personal thing, it's also a community. Every bit of trans literature that I'd seen up to 1988 was about individual struggle. And obviously, Tiny Pieces of Skull is about individual struggle, but it's also about individual struggle in the context of relationships, in the consciousness of being part of a community. And obviously, that it's very different now because the trans community is much larger than it was when I transitioned in the 70s. But nonetheless, community is an important part of it. And it's not just a coming to terms with oneself. It's about coming to terms with oneself through learning to get along with people.
And becoming more oneself when one realises one doesn't have to be completely approved of or even understood, is what I felt with Annabelle.
Exactly. I mean, it's called, the subtitle of the book is A Lesson in Manners, and that's very double-edged.
I felt that the use of that title when so much of American culture is, I was born in California, so I've experienced this from time to time, people wanting to tell you about your accent and what it might mean that you speak in a certain way, and manners and the sense of feeling mannered, feeling sort of strange or othered in that way.
Yeah, I mean, because that was my experience of the States, but it also was a thing I could do, because it becomes a running joke, is that everyone keeps telling Annabelle how English she is. And it was part of why I loved being in the States back then, because in the UK, I always feel slightly phony because I'm a social climbing working class kid. Whereas in the States, I could be this much posher person that I can quite get away with here.
Categorization does seem to come back to bite us in a lot of ways.
But the other thing about Tiny Pieces of Skull is that an awful lot of it's true, including a lot of the things that sound really implausible, like the circumstances in which at the end Annabelle and Natasha have suddenly to leave Chicago forever. That's exactly what happened. But that's a spoiler I'm not going to share. I mean, but it's all true.
I won't say anything about that because anything I say right now would fall into spoilers. So I'm going to ask you questions another time about that. But in terms of finding the writer that you are, what has supported, what has motivated you? Because in this conversation, something that was striking me was that as with Annabelle finding her identity and her sense of self through the things that she has to overcome, there's a part of it that it's a bit like the way bravery doesn't feel like bravery when something needs to happen and you're the person who needs to do it and you get on with it. Has some of it been like that? Has some of it been more curiosity? What has been the motivation, or what has supported?
One of the things was realizing I'm not very good at making people up. What I do in fiction, but also in my poetry, is find those bits of myself from which I can construct a viable person that feels like a different character. I mean, I'm not sure that the version of Catullus that's the authorial voice in my translations of Catullus is necessarily who he was, but it's a plausible version of who he was that draws on bits of him that I share, that I could empathise with.
Can I ask you to just clarify a bit about that for anyone who's not come across it yet?
Yeah, Catullus was a first century BCE Roman poet who, as far as we know, died when he was about 26, wrote a lot of very funny, very bitchy love poetry, mostly to an older mistress, some of it to young men. He also tried to write proper, serious, mythological poetry, because that's what a poet does. I, for various complicated reasons, got involved in writing a translation of all of his work, which, somewhat to my surprise, classicists mostly really liked. And what I did there, I mentioned the working class social climbing thing. Catullus was a kid from the sticks who moved to Rome to have a career and got himself involved with high society and used poetry very much as his calling card for high society. So the bitchy, funny, love-struck person is partly something that he creates for himself. It's something that I could empathize with, that process of self-creation. And that's how I translated him. It's not by strict verbal accuracy. It's by having a sense that, what is this poem for? Why is he saying this? What is the joke? Because a lot of him is very funny. Or what is that the bit of mythology he finds moving to empathize with? You construct a voice from bits of yourself. It's not necessarily you, but it's a mask that's mottled on your face. And when I was writing this ridiculous 750,000 word fantasy novel, it has two heroines and they're both very different from each other, but they're both in a sense me, in spite of the fact they're both effectively goddesses. And I use my competence for one character, except she's much cleverer than I am, because I set things up so she gets to be really clever all the time in a way that I'm not. And the other is an immortal who has known absolutely everyone. And I am a bit of a name dropper. And I love writing a character who can drop every name in human history.
And you can hear how, whatever genre you're in, there are certain community aspects, or how people relate to other people does really feel like a theme.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the themes, one of the community thing in the Rhapsody novels is there are a few characters in it who are hundreds or even thousands of years old. And a sense of they all get each other in a way that people who have an ordinary lifespan don't. I mean, some excited to talk about a community of immortals, or of people who are dead but still around and effectively immortal as ghosts or spirits. It's not a joke, but it is sort of an observation about how people would react. But it was also a matter of, I was sticking in a lot of real people. Some of them people where we know what they sounded like from people's description. And in a few cases, people that I could actually listen to their voice on YouTube. So in the fourth book, the young H.G. Wells gets to be a major character. And I prepared for writing the young H.G. Wells by listening to an awful lot of the old H.G. Wells on the radio. Because if there's a resource, you can get people's voices. I mean, probably the earliest figure whose voice I actually got to hear was Florence Nightingale. Because Florence Nightingale lived long enough that there are actually recordings of her voice. One would not necessarily have occurred to me before I bothered to check. Voice is really important, because voice is how we have a sense of things. And obviously, because I'm, as well as writing fiction, I'm a poet. That was very much a matter of finding my poetic voice, which is quite different yet again.
Do you find that when your brain is in poetry mode, fiction mode, something else, does the writing process or how you talk to yourself in your head? Does it feel very different? Do you
Yes.
feel?
Well, the thing is, because most of my poems are quite short, that's something that happens. The process whereby I write a poem is very different because I mostly write sonnets. I write strictly formal sonnets. And when I know I'm going to write a poem, I often work it out in my head in a way that I don't work fiction out in my head, because I won't necessarily know where a poem is going until I'm writing it. Because to some extent, because I write sonnets, my poetry is constrained by the form. So it's a matter of working it out like a puzzle, because I know I've got 14 lines rhymed A, B, B, A, C, D, D, C, E, F, F, E, G, G. And sometimes I know the first line, and sometimes I just know the final couplet.
And it's finding the rest of the jigsaw pieces around that.
And also having meter, having rhyme. That's a matter of. That's when I'm writing that form. I mean, I also write some long poems in quatrains, and that's looser, but that happens when it happens.
And structure, it's been very clear listening and reading a few of your other interviews that structure has always, or it sounds to me like, has always been very important and has always been an enjoyable thing.
Well, yes and no. I mean, the thing is, I'm actually putting together a second selection. And I'm going back to for the first 2 years after I started writing poetry again, I wasn't writing formal verse. I was writing very intense, very raw free verse, which was always very rhythmic. And in fact, and I've recently gone back to one of the longer things I wrote back then, which was about a group of about 14 poems in which I traced the rise and fall of a love affair I had in my 30s. And the reason I opted for writing structure is that though it's good, is so raw. I became a much posier and more structured writer, partly to protect myself from the rawness of that poem.
So structure can almost be armor. It can help you select the thoughts that come out and the thoughts that do not come out.
I mean, the poem I'm talking about is called Desire, and it's incredibly raw. I mean, it's actually very good. I mean, I've come to realize it's actually rather good. And I showed it to a number of people more recently who said, my God, I didn't know you could write like that. And I could briefly, but I didn't want to be that person because it's just too naked. And I'm putting the poem back out there now. And in fact, a friend is trying to adapt it as a theatre piece. But yes, I mean, to some extent, the post can be protection. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote a gigantic fantasy novel rather than writing something that was like Tiny Pieces of Skull, only about my life in my 30s, because I wanted the protection of writing in a different genre.
I wonder, hearing you say that, how and if that also applies to the position that you have needed to take with Twitter, where X, where we are confined to a number of syllables, and it became the forum for dealing with appalling
hatred,
political and personal hatred.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, one of the reasons I didn't write much in my 40s was I was very busy doing politics so much in my 40s. And I was doing politics in a much more genteel age where people were much nicer. Going through the teens of this century on Twitter, as is now X, was an instruction in just how horrible some people are.
And while I've run away, I've left Twitter. You have stayed making yourself.
No, I did. I left,
have you? You've left now?
Yes, I left about 2 months ago because I found myself using Blue Sky far more to say the things I wanted to say without having to cope with, you stink, because Twitter's just become so staggeringly childish. I just decided I no longer wanted that in my head.
And in terms of imagining, it's also about weighing up what change can my effort and my voice bring about, and is the profound stress, grief, unhappiness that goes into being in any particular room worth the result? Is that how you weigh it up? Because right now, in more than probably ever in my lifetime, or at least in my adulthood, we're having to face a lot of horrible things.
Yeah, I mean, and you can't be safe all the time. I mean, I'm not used to confronting personal hatred. And confronting it online is one thing, but I mean, there was a point a few months ago when I went to a perfectly ordinary publishing party and suddenly found myself being screamed at by a transphobe. Well, not screamed at because she was being soft-voiced and polite and expressing deep personal hatred for me in the middle of a social gathering. And I realized, yes, it really is that bad. And what was so peculiar about it was most people just didn't realize what was going on, because most people haven't confronted that kind of absolute hatred expressing itself in soft tones before. People say, well, what's going on? Why are you saying these things? It was a bit of an eye-opener about just, I mean, this was from another writer. It was a writer whose work I quite admire, but who absolutely detests and despises me for being transsexual and feels threatened by me for that.
I won't ask what she said if you don't want me to, and I'll take out me asking if you want me to, but...
No, she was just being accusatory about, I mean, it was standard hatred stuff. I mean, but the thing is, it had very little connection with anything I am or anything I've ever said. And she was also arguing with herself in order to make herself hate me more. It was very disturbing.
I think the examples of what it is people say are horrific, as it is useful for people to hear, because what I suppose and what tends to be happening is people are talking to a picture they have in their head. So
absolutely. I mean, basically, they have a set of beliefs about who trans people are that's all to do with fetishism, sexual fetishism. And you go, no. I mean, did I have a sexual fetish when I was 5? But they say, oh, you're just making that up. No. Because anything that disturbs their worldview cannot be true.
And we talked about categorization earlier in the context of class, of accent, of things like this. And this is something else, isn't it? That I overheard somebody doing that recently. And what I fundamentally heard him saying to his family was what was so terrible about this other person that he had to work with was you didn't know what category to put them in, and therefore you didn't know how to speak to them. And the fundamental sexism, classism, the idea that the way you speak to a human being is based on what category you're putting them in, is already something awful.
I mean, the point is, we do dehumanize people very easily. It's something one has constantly to struggle with. And it's also because you never actually understand people that well. I mean, having a couple of times realized that I didn't know people I thought I knew really well. Let's just say that. And discovering a whole other side to them, of which I'd mostly been unaware and to which I'd willfully blinded myself, perhaps, until it became too obvious for me to deal with anymore.
And then doesn't it become that the case of what we said about how, as with the real Natasha, you don't have to trust somebody completely, when is it worth getting them out of your life, and when is the cause served better by explaining as best you can how wrong they are and keeping the channels open? Yeah.
I mean, there gets to be a point with some people where you actually decide, I cannot be around this person anymore. And that's very painful. It is tearing people out of your heart. And that's something I know that I will struggle to write about. I've written about it in poetry. I will struggle to write about it in prose, though I will have to do that in the when and if I finally get on with the memoir.
I did want to ask about that, because in the biography from the Glamorous Rags website that I read at the beginning, you did say you're in the process of turning it into a memoir.
Well, I was then, and I'd written a number of chunks of memoir, which will be in the eventual book. But I then got sidetracked because around the same time, I'd been writing a lot of, short form. In the 90s, I was commissioned by Penguin to edit some anthologies. I persuaded a number of friends to co-edit with me, and we agreed that we'd write shared world anthologies of science fiction and fantasy. Mm. And their condition for working with me was that several of them had read Tiny Pieces and said, it's about time you wrote some more fiction. We liked your fiction. So I wrote 5 fantasy novellas, science fiction fantasy novellas. I also wrote a couple of other genre short stories around the same time. I then started work on a science fiction novel, which hit the 20,000 word mark, but then for various reasons died on me. I was very busy with politics because I was busy being deputy chair of an NGO.
Do you want to say what that was? Or?
Liberty. I was deputy chair of Liberty for the second half of the 90s and got caught up in a lot of quite vicious but polite internecine politics to do with the rise of Blairism, to do with the shift of the organisation away from the idea of civil liberties to the idea of human rights, whereas my view was you have to stress both for complex reasons I won't go into here. When that all went pear-shaped on me, as it eventually did, partly because my health collapsed, partly because my political projects collapsed, I started writing critical stuff about television and film because I'd also been working on a couple of major critical project reference books, and my relationship with one of those reference books got very problematic, and I had a series of very huge rows with close friends about it. I didn't particularly feel like writing anything about science fiction and fantasy books after that row, so I decided to write or edit and write books about genre film and genre television. On the back of that, I drifted into the fan fiction culture for a bit and wrote a lot of fanfic. And various friends said, don't you think it's time you got back to your own work? And a couple of other people said, you know, you've written so well about fantasy literature. It's about time you gave something back to the genre by writing something yourself. And I kind of got sidetracked from what I was working on with the memoir into what became the Rhapsody of Blood novels, because I started thinking, when I was writing fanfic, I had a couple of ideas that were partly fanfic ideas and partly ideas as to where I thought ongoing shows were going. And they weren't where those shows were going. And they were really good plot bunnies. And one of those plot bunnies is what became the three-quarters of a million words of the Rhapsody of Blood book, because it was a good plot bunny. And I chased it down a hole and ended up with this vast historical survey of the whole of human history with magic in it, which just goes to show that sometimes thinking about other people's work and getting what they're doing wrong is the most productive thing you can possibly be doing.
For you, both as a writer with deadlines and practical things to get in, but also as a writer who is writing for pleasure, for self-expression, to give ideas to the world, what has and hasn't worked for you in terms of your writing life? Is there a certain number of hours in the day that the writing brain is active, after which it says stop now? Or what is that like for you? Are there times, are there rituals?
Well, there are whole periods when I'm not writing. It's not that I'm blocked. It's that sometimes I just can't get it together because I get tired, I get ill. I'm not as diligent a writer as I should be. I've been slightly burned out ever since I finished the Rhapsody books. I've written a certain amount of poetry. I'm working on a short story right now, and it will be the first thing I've actually, when I write it, because I've got a deadline on it now, so I will have to write it. I'm the world's worst person to ask this question, because I spent huge chunks of my life not writing.
But you said deadlines. You've said deadlines.
I've got a deadline for the short story because I know when I've got to. The editor of the anthology it's for has told me when he needs it by, so that is a deadline. And
that becomes real because somebody else has said this exists.
And that was the thing with writing 250,000 words, is 750,000 words, is that I did know after that I had to finish the damn thing, because if you're going to get people reading a vast fantasy novel, you damn well should need to finish looking in certain directions. Sorry. I'm used to deadlines because I work on a monthly cycle as a publisher's reader. I know that I have by the end of the month to get everything off my desk because in order to be able to do an invoice and get paid. I'm not doing much reviewing anymore. when I was reviewing, I usually needed a deadline to get it done because it's that whole thing left over from university where you're having to do a weekly essay teaches you to meet deadlines.
Yes. And also that existent beats perfect.
Yeah. I mean, it's that thing the composer Edward Lutyens once said when she was doing her film scores. Do you watch it on Thursday or do you want it good?
Yes. Although sometimes if you don't have that Thursday, it can be as good as it likes, but if it doesn't emerge, the world doesn't get it.
Well, quite.
So it's finding the balance, really, isn't it?
Yes, it's a matter of finding the balance. I mean, I don't know. I mean, as you know, I mean, I do once a year for your write-a-thon thing, write a poem in a day, write a long poem in a day, knowing I have to deliver it by a certain time.
Shall we do a little plug for that now? That writing thing. That'll be Greening Sponsored Write, which is for Macmillan Cancer Support, and a bunch of published authors, including Roz, and developing writers in the Writers' Gym, and many people who are both those things come and write for a day on a theme that's something to do with green or something to do with quality of life. And that is the writing thing. Yeah,
but what I've tended to do for that is add to the corpus of my ballads, which are a series of poems set in an imaginary 18th century. I can usually find some hook in the thing in the set word to write one of these. I mean, it was Emergence. It was a thing about a woman discovering that all the plants growing on her brother's grave are poison, and getting a hint that he is trying to communicate to her that he was murdered and needs to start punishing people. With the rather fanciful construction I put on the word emergence.
And this is the whole point of it, is although it's an exclusive for 6 months, it goes in the anthology that goes out to our sponsors the day after it's written. It goes out to whoever has sponsored Macmillan through our Just Giving page. After those 6 months, the writers get to do with it what they want, and it is very much what you want. There's absolutely no expectations on word count, content, anything. The idea is that this writing is born, that for me it's good coming out of a bad situation, because it didn't make the horrible things go away. It doesn't make my friend any less dead, but using her chosen charity to do something that is good for writing and is good for the charity. I think meaning is not precisely what I mean, but it's the closest thing to meaning I got out of it, is what can I do with the time I have available? And I think that does feed into writing as well.
Yeah. I mean, I will write the memoir. It's just that I'm old and tired, but I've written about a third of it. So part of what I've got to do with it is take the bits that I already wrote and realize that some of them have to be rewritten. Because, for example, when I wrote about my childhood in 1999, I wrote about how one of the biggest traumas of my childhood was when I was 7, I discovered that over the summer vacation between infant school and junior school, my best friend had died. And in fact, he hadn't, because she got in touch with me a few years later. But I'd been told she died, and everyone had been told she died, for reasons that are too implausible for fiction. Let's just say that.
This is it, isn't it? And the world can only benefit from the stories it is permitted to share. So if you ever want to exchange a deadline or two, so that we go, this will be on the page by a certain date, I'm all for that.
Life comes with plot twists that you wouldn't dare make up. I mean, who would have thought that a much-loved children's author would become the leader of a crypto-fascist ideology?
Well, I mean, I grew up with Roald Dahl, so I had a head start.
I mean, he's a terrific writer, but what a horrid person he was.
And I've got a T.S. Eliot quote right behind my head that I find enormously helpful. Time yet. And look at him.
Eliot was vile. I did those Guardian pieces about Eliot's poetry, and it was really, I mean, you talk about killing the father. Now, Eliot is, as a poet, Eliot is the father you absolutely have to kill, because he was a bit of a monster, frankly. And it's not just the anti-Semitism, bad as that is. It's the incredibly bad treatment of women. I mean, Eliot's sexism. You realise that during the World War II, because he had power of attorney, he could have moved his ex-wife, who was in a mental hospital. He could have got her transferred to somewhere that wasn't in London, was less likely to be blown up in the Blitz, and didn't. Now that's a layer of absolute unpleasantness that transcends the political.
Yeah. And my attitude, I don't know if it has been yours, but death of the author, of letting what they put into the world continue when they don't, was sort of my default position at university, because after a first year of English literature, when you realise everybody you're learning about didn't think you were a good idea at all, it almost went without, it became a necessity for me. And
Yeah,
I don't know where the lines are, and I think we all at some level are finding.
because I like Catullus. I like who he was. But at the end of the day, he was living in Republican Rome. He makes jokes about being too broke to afford good slaves. He writes poems of social embarrassment about not owning very good slaves. And you go, yeah, I mean, one puts that on the page and one goes, oh my God, that's awful.
If there is anything writing habit wise or expectations of yourself or relationships with yourself,
Oh, right.
what has worked for you that you would pass on to the people out there starting now?
Do research more than you need, and then throw half your research away. Decide which bits of your research you can use, and don't go on doing research to a point where the research gets to be an end in itself. Think about what research is for. I mean, having written a lot of historical segments in the Rhapsody books, it was very much a matter of, I need to know everything about historical periods I'm setting things in. And sometimes you don't actually need to do the research, you just need to watch a couple of good movies. I mean, I did, when I was writing about the St. Bartholomew Day Massacre, I just looked at a film about it. Sometime when I was writing about first century Alexandria, I read a couple of other people's thrillers set then, and one of which had a really good map. So I knew where bits of the city were in relation to each other. And that was all I needed to know. But the other thing is, when your research tells you can't do something, listen, because you can always find a way around the facts without actually cheating. So I wrote a section, I was planning a section set in London in the late 1720s, because I wanted to write about the young Voltaire when he was in London. And I also wanted to have Isaac Newton as the villain. And I also wanted to have as a character the super fence Jonathan Wild, who was simultaneously running much of what existed as a police force and organising a crime empire. And unfortunately, he got hanged 18 months before Voltaire got to London. So I couldn't have them in the same story. I thought, well, I'm not going to cheat on that. There has to be a way around it. I thought, well, the fictional versions of Wilde in Gay's The Beggar's Opera, and because of Gay's The Beggar's Opera, Brecht and Weil's The Shrewsbury Opera, have a daughter. So why don't I create Jonathan Wilde's, in fact, non-existent daughter? And I tried that. And I started writing her dialogue, and she walked onto the page, and I instantly realized I loved writing this character's voice. And I thought, why don't we know about her? Oh, well, that's because she scrubbed the record, because my version of Isaac Newton, as well as running the Mint, was actually had inherited the security services. I decided that she takes over from Newton running the security services and removes herself from the records, and also takes the elixir of life that Newton doing alchemy was too cowardly to take. And suddenly I had an entire stream of plot just because I didn't cheat about her father.
And also because you used research to ignite, but not to overshadow.
Exactly. And sometimes doing your research thoroughly will give you things that you didn't know were there. I needed someone to tip off my heroine that the French Revolution was going the wrong way. And I just was reading around the subject, someone who actually realized the French Revolution was going dodgy and got out, which was Talleyrand. And then I discovered that Talleyrand had a young priest just done the tourist thing of visiting Voltaire on Voltaire's deathbed, not to save his soul, just because he felt like meeting him. And so I got to write the scene of the young priest Talleyrand talking to the old dying Voltaire, and put my heroine in that scene. And that meant I also discovered that before going off to America, after he'd left the Revolution in France, Talleyrand was briefly in London. So I basically had someone that my heroine had met because I'd written that scene because I loved the idea of that scene, which there's no record of Talleyrand and Voltaire. I thought, well, that also means she'll like him and trust him. So when he says the French Revolution is going wrong, she'll listen. And he's in London, and I need her to be there. And research will sometimes show you things, show you bones. Don't cheat. You can somehow avoid cheating. The other thing is that your first idea is not always your good idea. Sometimes you think of a way of getting out of a hole, and if it's too complicated, it's probably the thing they try that doesn't work, and then they think of a far simpler way out of the hole. And usually, always remember Chekhov's gun. You know, if you're going, I mean, Chekhov said that if you hang a gun on the wall in the first act, you need to fire it by the third. There's a corollary of that, which is that if you stick a lot of things in your writing, you make sure to use all of them. And if you planted a lot of little plot details, they are there when you need, because often you need to fire that gun, and you need to work out that gun is there to fire. I'm talking elliptically, because I'm not going to give an example.
And sometimes not, sometimes an actual gun. But that's wonderful advice, Roz. Thank you very much. I'm hoping we will see you for the sponsored write.
You will.
Good. So you will be back in the writers' gym before long. But for now, I just want to say,
love to.
Good. I would just like to say a massive thank you. But anything else you want to say to our world before we go?
Be more diligent than I am. I mean, I'm terribly lazy about getting on with things, and do not be me.
I would love to be a third as articulate as you in anything, but I will take the advice and say thank you for it. Roz Kaveney, thank you for joining the Writers' Gym. You've visited the Writers' Gym with author and coach Dr. Rachel Knightley. Production and sound design are by Ashley Lexine, and theme music is by Chris Gregory. To join a Writers' Gym workout online or in London, as a guest or as a member, visit writersgym.com or email thewritersgym@rachelknightley.com.